So I want to talk today about Lenin's economic policies. And remember, when we talk about economic policies, we always talk about industry and agriculture. So with Lenin, there's three main policies that we have to try and remember. And I always think about Lenin's face to help me remember these. So you've got his cap, he always wears a cap, reminding you that it's state capitalism first, and I'll go into that in a minute. Then you think of his eyes maybe, and think about his vision, the idea that he wants communism, but he also wants control of the whole country. So that will help you think about war communism. That's the policy that helps him win the civil war and introduce really hardline communist policies in order for him to do that. And then also you think about his mouth and maybe think about him smiling because after the Civil War, the country was in such a crisis that he has to do something to try and make people smile, to make people like him, to keep him in power, which obviously is going to make him happy. So think about the new economic policy, the NEP, as that kind of thing that makes everyone happy, that makes everyone kind of trust in him again, and him happy because he's kept his leadership. So just going back to state capitalism, I'm going to run through them really quickly just to give you some kind of basic sense of what the kind of key things are. So obviously the Bolsheviks don't have control of everything. They've only really got control in Moscow. So they need to set out some decrees, and there's lots of different decrees, but the main one I want you to remember is the decree on land. This is a really early one, 1918, and it's really popular with the peasants because it means that they can take the land off all the big landowners, and particularly the church, and divide it up and have their own land, farm, and to make food for themselves and to sell food. So it's not state owned, it's still owned by the peasants, but it's really, really popular, and it's taking the land off the rich basically for the poor to have. So a pretty easy one to remember. The other really easy part of state capitalism is that basically all the large industries are nationalised, so they're taken under state control. So the Bolsheviks will have control of steel production, iron production, all of those kind of things. But in some ways, they don't really change things that much because they still have them run by experts. So they choose an expert, the Supreme Soviet chooses a group of people, experts, and they pay them quite a lot of money to run these large industries, the Vysenka. So it's quite unpopular with the party because really they're just like capitalists. They're just like it was before. So not that much change, even though nominally they are under state control, they're still being run in pretty much the same way. But the basic principle of state capitalism is that the state are going to coordinate, organise, get in control of the economy, economic production, so what is produced in the economy. And they're going to think about what the needs of the new society are, and they're going to organise industry themselves and control it themselves. And really, this is the beginning of policies later on. When we look at Stalin, we'll look at his sort of command economy, where he takes control and he decides what is being produced and when it's being produced and how it's being produced. So really, that's the beginnings of that. And of course, in June 1918, civil war breaks out. And we know this is coming. We know the Bolsheviks have got to win control of the whole country. And so it's emergency measures. And that's what war communism is all about. There is a civil war. And so they put in these very hardline communist measures in order to win the civil war. So the main aim is to win war. So, of course, they're going to be producing war goods like guns and, machinery for helping the army, the Red Army. And they want the workforce to kind of be efficient. So they make sure that everyone is working. They make sure that people work really long days. So 11-hour days are introduced. And of course, in agriculture, they want to be able to feed the army and feed the workers. So they take the grain requisitioning. That just means taking the grain off the farmers in order to feed the workers, and particularly the Red Army. So grain requisitioning is really unpopular. The Cheka, that's the kind of terror, secret police that go into local villages to take the grain off the peasants, are really unpopular. This is the beginnings of terror, if you like. And it's called a food dictatorship. That's the government dictating that they must have all the food. And of course, it's really unpopular with the peasants. And it does mean that peasants stop producing food. Like, what's the point if it's going to be taken away from you? And actually, there's a massive famine. So this really does lead to famine. This grain requisitioning is a complete disaster in terms of agricultural production in the long term. So there is total nationalism. Everything is nationalised. It's actually illegal to make any kind of profit or to have any kind of private trade. And there's conscription, like there was in World War I here. So people are have to be employed by the government, and they're told what they have to do. And basically, there's really harsh measures if you step out of line. So there's a lot of control by the secret police and the Cheka, and there's lots of kind of state demands on people. People have to work. They have to do basically as they're told. And also there's a complete abolition of money and the market. I mean, there was massive hyperinflation. You might know about that if you've studied Germany and Nazis. So that basically where the value of money just disappears. You could have millions and millions of rubles, but they just aren't worth anything. So money is kind of made like useless. Services are free, so transport, for example, is free to workers, and people get rations. So there's lots of rationing. So it's really like a war economy would be in this country. Okay, so it's conscription, rationing, etc. War communism, quite harsh measures, but basically in order to win a war. So think about like a war economy, what is needed in order for them to win the war. And of course, when you think about the consequences, so with all of these things, I'm thinking about the aims, what the actual policies were, what the features of the policies are, and what the consequences are. So with the consequences, of course, they win the war. Great, they get control. Brilliant. But there's absolute economic collapse. All the workers have disappeared because there's no food. So they've gone back to the countryside to see if they can kind of scrounge some food. Agriculture production is really, really low. Like, no one's producing any food because they can't sell it. The big thing is basically there is a massive famine. 6 million people are supposed to have died in this particular famine of 1922. Real kind of hunger and poverty across the whole country. And of course, because of all of this, industrial production falls. It goes in half. So it goes from 3 million to just under 1.5, so 1.2 million by 1922. So it's a complete disaster economically. The country is on its knees. So yes, the Bolsheviks win the war, but the country is economically in a mess. Also, coming from this, there is a growing black market. So there's a kind of a hidden market, a market that's not really legal, but it's there kind of providing things through sort of secret means, through kind of illegal means. And actually, they estimate that 60% of food was actually dealt with in the black market. So actually, even the grain requisitioning wasn't enough to feed people. And workers in their factories, like steel factories, for example, were very kind of good at stealing stuff. So scrap metal would have been squirreled away to make things like lighters to sell. So people that could get their hands on anything would definitely kind of try and sell it on the black market. And the other really big shortage, other than food and sort of goods, basic industrial goods, was fuel. There wasn't enough fuel for people to, heat their stoves, cook food. And in fact, in Petrograd, the government actually said that it was okay to pull down government buildings that were made of wood in order to have fire and to have fuel for the winter. So massive fuel shortages. So basically a big picture of poverty. So the consequences of war communism is basically economic collapse and massive poverty and famine. So really bad situation, complete political crisis. And two kind of main signals that there's a crisis is there's a big peasant rebellion in Tambov. So it's a region where there was a massive outbreak of peasant revolt, so a peasant rebellion, and there was also a soldiers' rebellion on Kronstadt, which was a naval base, and that was really surprising to Lenin because traditionally these soldiers had supported the revolution, but they just were completely disillusioned by it. They didn't like the way things were being run, and so there was a big revolt. And even though Lenin crushed both of these sort of revolutions or rebellions or revolts, he still knew that there was big problems and that he needed to sort them out. So That brings us to the introduction of the NEP, the New Economic Policy. And the aims of this were basically just to keep power. Lenin knew that he needed to do something pretty quickly and pretty drastically in order to keep power. So he wanted peace with the peasants. Remember, the peasants make up 80% of the country's population. So they're a big group of people that the Communist Party have to try and win over. So they've got to make peace with the peasants. They've got to make the people happy, basically. They also need to revive the economy. They need to try and get the industry going again, get agriculture going again, stop the famine. So they have this vision that they're going to build socialism, which is a sort of step before communism, but with capitalist methods. So the NEP is a step backwards away from communist sort of total state control, state government, and to allow some kind of capitalist free market. So that basically means that people can buy and sell and produce freely. And the main areas where they were allowed to do this was basically agriculture. So they wanted to get food production up. So they allowed a complete free market again. So peasants could grow food, they could grow surplus, they could go and sell that surplus, people could buy it. They reintroduced money so people could buy things, particularly food. And there was a bit of tax. So there was still a little bit of money getting taken from the peasants, but this time no grain requisitioning, just a bit of tax on their profits. The other people that were allowed to make profits were basically small factories, so under 20 employees. These were allowed to be set up. So small sort of industry, again, were allowed to make profits and they were allowed to trade things and make money. Large industry was still nationalised, but the money from the taxes that were coming in was being fed into kind of regenerating that. So actually, as a consequence, this did produce economic stability. People stopped being hungry, people stopped not having fuel, and people actually were fairly satisfied with this. People were fairly content. There were some hardliners within the party, particularly Trotsky, who thought this was completely backtracking on all kind of communist ideology. So it was not always popular within the party, but this idea that they were still working towards socialism, but they were going to allow a little bit of capitalism in there to get the economy going, kind of won over most people. However, it didn't really get the economy fully going again. So although the food and agriculture was working and people were being fed and the famine was ended, actually the industry was not being invested in enough. They didn't have enough taxes to kind of really invest in industry. So there was a bit of a sort of plateau. There was a bit of a sort of stagnation in industry. And it all kind of comes to a head with something called the scissor crisis in 1923. And the scissor crisis basically is just when the farmer's income is not enough to pay the prices of things being produced in industry. So the classic example is tractors. So that, the industry was producing farm machinery, plows, tractors, like simple basic tractors, but the farmers were nowhere near producing enough income in order to pay for them. And this basically meant that people weren't buying the goods that industry were being producing. So they had to subsidise it. The government had to subsidise industry to reduce the prices and make them more affordable. But the scissor crisis was a sign really that things weren't really working that effectively in the economy. Even though Lenin was trying really hard to improve living standards, things like the electrification campaign, where he tried to get electricity across the whole country, again, that produced employment. It produced the opportunity to set up new factories. If there was electricity, you could build and make new factories and new towns. But it wasn't enough to really get industry working effectively. So those three policies, a quick run through. I hope that's helped. There's lots of little facts and figures you can add to that, but that's a kind of basic structure to get your head around it. And then hopefully you can try and learn like maybe one or two little statistics to help support that once you've got the basics in your head. Okay, so try and just learn the three economic policies, learn a little bit about what the aims are, a little bit about the features of it, what it's like, what it involves, and then really think about the consequences are, because quite often in these economic exam questions, you're asked about the consequences of the economic policies. Were they successful or did they fail? Did the benefits outweigh the costs, or did the costs outweigh the benefits? So really thinking about the impact it had on people, the impact it had on the party, and the impact it had on the leader and kind of control of the population. Okay, more coming up on Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev through the week. Thanks.